February 1945. The Italian Apennines. American soldiers from the 10th Mountain Division climb frozen cliffs in darkness, their packs loaded with sea rations that have turned solid as bricks in the sub-zero temperatures. Meanwhile, Canadian forces fighting in similar conditions face the exact same problem. This is the untold story of how two allied nations approached one of warfare's most mundane yet critical challenges: feeding soldiers in extreme cold. And contrary to popular myth, the reality was far more complex than a simple winner-takes-all comparison. The question of which nation had superior cold-weather rations has become something of a military legend, repeated in mess halls and veteran gatherings for decades. But the historical record reveals a different narrative, one of shared struggles, parallel innovations, and a common enemy that neither nation fully conquered during the war: the physics of frozen food and the caloric demands of combat in brutal cold. The foundation of failure. When World War II erupted, neither Canada nor the United States possessed adequate field rations for sustained operations in extreme cold. Both nations entered the conflict with systems designed primarily for temperate climates, and both would spend the war years scrambling to adapt. The American system, designated with letters A through K, represented an evolution from World War I's crude reserve rations. The C ration, standardized in 1939, consisted of canned meat and bread components packed in 12-ounce cylindrical tins. It was heavy, monotonous, and designed for no more than 3 consecutive days of use. The K ration, developed by physiologist and cell Keys in 1941, was lighter and more compact, intended as a short-duration emergency meal that could fit in a soldier's pocket. Its 3 daily meals provided approximately 2,830 kilocalories, packaged in wax-coated cardboard boxes. Canada, having witnessed the inadequacies of British Army rations during the Great War, began developing its own procurement program in the 1920s. By the time war came in 1939, Canadian ration development had taken on what military planners called a Commonwealth flavor, creating systems similar to but separate from British equivalents. Like their American allies, Canadian forces relied heavily on canned goods, hard textile biscuits, and preserved meats. The fundamental problem facing both nations was identical. Their rations were calibrated for soldiers operating in moderate climates with moderate exertion levels. Neither system accounted for the drastically increased caloric demands of combat in extreme cold, where the human body burns energy at exponentially higher rates simply to maintain core temperature. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps initially calculated that 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day would sustain an active soldier. This proved catastrophically insufficient for mountain and winter warfare. Men operating in high-altitude, cold-weather environments required 4,800 calories or more per day, according to specifications developed for specialized mountain rations. Yet the standard K ration, which became ubiquitous across all theaters, fell nearly 2,000 calories short of this requirement. Field reports from the European theater noted that malnutrition became evident among troops forced to subsist on K rations for extended periods, particularly those working in bitter cold. A 1943 assessment concluded that none of the packaged rations were recommended for continued use by active troops for periods exceeding 10 days. The Canadian situation paralleled the American experience. While specific caloric data from Canadian World War II rations remains limited in declassified documents, the fundamental challenge was universal. How do you pack enough energy density into a portable package that won't freeze solid, can be prepared with minimal equipment, and remains palatable enough that soldiers will actually consume it? Neither nation had solved this equation by 1942. The specialized American mountain ration, developed specifically for the 10th Mountain Division's high-altitude operations, represented the most sophisticated attempt to address cold weather feeding. Introduced in 1941 to 42 based on recommendations from experimental mountain warfare companies, it was designed to provide 4,800 kilocalories per man per day, weigh less than 40 ounces, contain adequate roughage for slow digestion, and be relatively easy to prepare at high altitudes. But here's where the story takes an ironic turn. The mountain ration was intensely disliked by the Quartermaster Command precisely because of its specialization and higher cost. To bolster arguments against it, Quartermaster Corps staff criticized the ration for its weight, despite the fact that for its caloric content, a day's mountain ration was actually lighter than alternative canned C rations. The political battle over ration standardization would ultimately trump tactical necessity. By early 1943, less than 3 months after its adoption, the Quartermaster Corps was already requesting the Army abolish all non-standard lightweight individual rations except the K and D rations. The mountain ration, along with the jungle ration and the 5-in-1 group ration, would eventually be replaced by the standardized 10-in-1 ration, sacrificing specialized optimization for logistical simplicity. The cold equation. The science of cold weather nutrition reveals why both American and Canadian standard rations fell short. When a soldier operates in temperatures below freezing, his body faces a dual energy crisis. First, maintaining core temperature requires constant caloric expenditure, a metabolic tax that increases exponentially as ambient temperature drops. Second, the physical demands of moving through snow, climbing frozen terrain, and carrying heavy equipment while wearing restrictive cold weather gear multiply energy expenditure far beyond normal infantry operations. Modern studies conducted by the Canadian Armed Forces in controlled environments demonstrate the scale of this challenge. When CAF personnel performed standardized strenuous infantry activities in -10 degrees Celsius, their energy expenditure and nutritional needs differed markedly from the same activities performed in temperate conditions. The body's caloric requirements in extreme cold can approach 5,000 to 6,000 kilocalories per day for active soldiers. Neither the American K ration nor the C ration approached these numbers. The complete K ration's 2,830 kilocalories represented barely half of what was needed. Even consuming all 3 C ration meals might provide only 3,300 to 3,800 calories, still falling short while adding prohibitive weight to a soldier's load. But raw caloric numbers tell only part of the story. The macronutrient composition matters critically in cold environments. Fat provides more than twice the energy per gram compared to carbohydrates or protein, making it the most efficient fuel source for weight-conscious field rations. Yet fat also has a problematic characteristic. It solidifies in cold temperatures. The canned meat components of C rations, which contain significant fat content, would congeal into inedible masses in freezing temperatures. The chocolate D ration bars, designed to provide 600 calories of quick energy, became tooth-breakingly hard in the cold. Soldiers developed field-expedient solutions, none of them ideal. Some men carried ration cans inside their clothing, using body heat to keep contents semi-liquid. Others melted snow to create hot water for warming canned goods, a time-consuming process that required fuel, equipment, and most dangerously, created visible smoke that could reveal positions to enemy forces. The wax-coated cardboard packaging of K rations offered slight advantages in cold weather compared to metal cans. The breakfast, dinner, and supper units could be broken down and distributed across a soldier's pockets, allowing body heat to keep contents marginally warmer. The crackers and biscuits remained edible when frozen, unlike canned items. But the K ration's fundamental caloric insufficiency meant that soldiers eating them exclusively in cold weather were essentially starving while fighting. Contemporary accounts from the 10th Mountain Division's Italian campaign illustrate the reality. Despite having access to the specialized mountain ration, troops often received standard C and K rations instead due to supply constraints and the Quartermaster Corps' preference for standardization. Men fighting in the frozen Apennines in February 1945, assaulting positions like Riva Ridge and Mount Belvedere in temperatures well below freezing, frequently subsisted on rations designed for temperate climate use. The result was predictable. Diagnosed cases of malnutrition and vitamin deficiency appeared among light infantry units forced to consume K rations for extended periods. Significantly, such cases were less common among 10th Mountain Division troops, but not because they had exclusively better rations. Rather, they received greater variety, rotating between mountain rations, K rations, C rations, and 10-in-1 group rations as availability permitted. The Canadian experience, while less extensively documented in English-language sources for World War II specifically, followed similar patterns. Canadian forces operating in cold environments, whether in the Italian campaign alongside American units or in Northern European operations, faced identical challenges of inadequate caloric density, frozen food containers, and the constant energy deficit of winter warfare. The fundamental physics couldn't be legislated away by either nation's Quartermaster Corps. A soldier burning 5,000 calories per day in sub-zero temperatures while carrying 60 pounds of equipment up a mountain couldn't maintain combat effectiveness on 3,000 calories, regardless of whether those calories came packaged with a maple leaf or stars and stripes. The myth of superiority. So where did the persistent legend of superior Canadian cold weather rations originate? The answer lies not in World War II, but in the decades that followed, and in a fundamental misunderstanding of what was being compared. The Canadian Forces Modern Individual Meal Pack, or IMP, introduced in the 1980s, earned genuine respect for its approach to field feeding. Each IMP provides approximately 1,200 calories per meal, with 3 packs delivering 3,600 calories over 24 hours. The meals use retort pouch technology, boil-and-bag preparations that require less heating time and equipment than traditional canned goods. The system emphasizes flexibility. Meals can be consumed cold, but when circumstances permit, they're easily heated by placing pouches in boiling water for 5 minutes or using chemical flameless heaters. This modern Canadian system has drawn favorable comparisons to American MREs, with some users praising the IMP's perceived food quality, variety, and the practical aspects like resealable packaging and waterproof containers. But here's the critical distinction that gets lost in barroom debates. These comparisons involve late 20th and early 21st century rations, not World War II systems. The IMP didn't exist during the Second World War. The retort pouch technology it employs wasn't commercially viable until decades after 1945. When modern soldiers or military enthusiasts compare Canadian IMPs favorably to American MREs, they're discussing entirely different ration generations with no direct connection to the wartime experience. The legend then undergoes a kind of temporal displacement, where present-day observations get retroactively projected onto historical events they don't actually describe. Another source of confusion stems from post-war ration development paths. During the Cold War era, Canada's Arctic sovereignty concerns and NATO commitments in Northern Europe drove continued focus on cold weather operational capability. The Canadian military maintained greater institutional emphasis on Arctic training and cold weather preparedness than most nations, including the United States for certain periods. This focus naturally extended to ration development, with Canadian researchers conducting extensive studies on nutritional requirements in extreme cold. A 2019 study published in Military Medical Research, for instance, examined dietary intakes of Canadian Armed Forces personnel consuming field rations during standardized infantry activities at various temperatures, including -10 degrees Celsius. Such research informed modern ration design, but it reflects late 20th and early 21st century science, not World War II era knowledge or capabilities. The reality of World War II was one of shared inadequacy rather than national superiority. Both American and Canadian soldiers in cold weather environments struggled with rations that were fundamentally insufficient for the conditions they faced. Both nations' military establishments initially underestimated the caloric requirements of winter and mountain warfare. Both encountered the same physical problems of frozen food, inadequate energy density, and monotonous menus that sapped morale as much as they failed to provide nutrition. The most significant American innovation, the mountain ration, proved too specialized and expensive for widespread adoption. It was killed not by Canadian competition but by American bureaucratic preference for standardization and lower costs. The Quartermaster Corps' decision to discontinue specialized rations and rely instead on K and C rations for all conditions represented a triumph of logistics over tactical reality. If there was any meaningful difference between American and Canadian approaches during World War II, it lay not in ration superiority but in operational deployment. Canadian forces, while certainly operating in cold conditions during the Italian campaign and Northwest Europe, weren't predominantly deployed as specialized mountain troops. The 10th Mountain Division represented America's unique commitment to creating an entire division specifically for high-altitude, cold-weather warfare, which meant American forces faced the most extreme feeding challenges in theaters like the Italian Apennines. By contrast, Canadian infantry typically operated in conditions where standard field rations, while far from ideal, remained marginally more viable than they were at 10,000 feet elevation in February. This difference in operational context, not ration quality, may have contributed to differing experiences and subsequent memories. But this reflects deployment patterns, not superior Canadian ration science. The real lessons learned. The actual innovations in cold weather rations came from the problems both nations identified during World War II, but couldn't fully solve until decades later. The war exposed critical gaps that would drive post-war research and development. First among these was energy density. Military nutritionists and ration developers learned that cold weather rations needed to prioritize fat content for maximum calories per weight unit, while simultaneously addressing the solidification problem that made high-fat rations problematic in freezing temperatures. The solution would eventually come through improved food processing technologies that could maintain fat in more stable forms, and through packaging innovations that made heating more practical in field conditions. Second was the preparation equation. Both K and C rations assumed soldiers would have some means of heating food, but the reality of combat made fires or cooking often impossible. The wax-coated cardboard of K rations worked better than metal cans in this regard, but the fundamental issue remained. Hungry soldiers needed food they could eat immediately, in any temperature, without preparation that might compromise operational security. This lesson would directly inform the development of freeze-dried rations and eventually the retort pouch technology used in modern MREs and IMPs. These systems allowed pre-cooked food to be consumed cold if necessary, while remaining easily heatable when conditions permitted. The third critical insight involved micronutrient balance and digestive efficiency. Field reports from all theaters indicated that monotonous rations led not just to morale problems but to genuine nutritional deficiencies. Vitamin deficiencies appeared among troops on extended K-ration diets. The human digestive system requires variety and roughage to function optimally, particularly under the physical stress of combat. Post-war ration development would place increasing emphasis on menu variety, vitamin fortification, and including components that supported digestive health. Modern rations from both nations feature far greater variety than their World War II ancestors, with 10, 20, or even 30 different menu options compared to the 3 varieties of wartime C rations. The bureaucratic lesson proved equally important, though often ignored. The Quartermaster Corps' decision to sacrifice the specialized mountain ration for standardized alternatives demonstrated how institutional biases toward cost efficiency and logistical simplicity could override tactical necessity. After the war, as both diagnosed cases of malnutrition and vitamin deficiency among World War II veterans became undeniable, the Quartermaster Corps attempted to shift responsibility for individual ration inadequacies, suddenly claiming that overuse of K and C rations beyond 2 or 3 days had caused the problems. This contravened their earlier statements and begged an obvious question. How could Army commanders observe ration rotation restrictions for troops in daily contact with a determined enemy? The lesson here transcended ration design itself and spoke to the eternal tension between specialized optimization and standardized efficiency in military logistics. Both approaches have merit. The challenge lies in knowing when each is appropriate and having the institutional flexibility to choose correctly. Modern military establishments in both Canada and the United States learned, eventually, to maintain both standard and specialized ration options, accepting some additional logistical complexity in exchange for tactical effectiveness. Neither nation perfectly resolved the cold weather feeding challenge during World War II. Both contributed to the eventual solutions through hard-won field experience and post-war research. The idea that one nation had dramatically superior rations during the war is historical mythology, born from later comparisons and nostalgic memory rather than documented evidence. The human element. Beyond the technical specifications and bureaucratic decisions lies the human reality of cold weather combat and the role rations played in it. Soldiers of both nations developed remarkably similar coping strategies and attitudes toward their field food. Trading ration components became a universal practice. Men would swap unpopular items for preferred ones, creating informal economies within units. In both American and Canadian forces, certain menu items became prized while others were universally despised. The accessory packets in American rations, containing cigarettes, matches, toilet paper, and hard candy, often held more trading value than the food itself. Soldiers learned to be opportunistic about supplementation. Whenever possible, they would scrounge, trade with locals, or liberate supplies to augment their official rations. Italian civilians, despite their own privations, sometimes traded fresh eggs, bread, or wine with allied soldiers. A can of military-issue coffee might buy a hot meal from a farmhouse kitchen. These transactions weren't just about improved nutrition. They represented brief human connections in the dehumanizing context of war. The psychological impact of inadequate or monotonous rations extended beyond simple morale. Food represents one of the few comforts available to combat soldiers, a tangible link to normalcy and home. When rations failed to satisfy, either because of insufficient calories, terrible taste, or simple repetitive monotony, it compounded the misery of cold, fear, exhaustion, and separation from loved ones. Mail from home often included descriptions of family meals, which soldiers would read while choking down their third consecutive day of canned hash. Veterans' memoirs from both American and Canadian forces reveal how much mental energy soldiers devoted to fantasizing about food. Men would spend hours describing in minute detail the meals they would eat when they got home, creating elaborate mental menus as a form of psychological escape. The first meal after returning to rear areas, or better yet, after returning home, became a defining memory for many veterans. These recollections often emphasized not just the quality or quantity of food, but the simple act of eating something hot, fresh, and chosen rather than assigned. The class and cultural dimensions of ration experience also deserve recognition. The 10th Mountain Division, recruited heavily from college-educated skiers and mountaineers, had members who in civilian life had experienced far better food than the average working-class draftee. For them, the descent from peacetime plenty to wartime rations may have been more jarring. Similarly, soldiers from farming backgrounds or rural areas often had more practical knowledge about supplementing rations through foraging or field-expedient cooking than urban-raised troops. Canadian forces, drawn from a nation with significant francophone population, brought different culinary expectations than their American counterparts. French-Canadian soldiers, in particular, came from a food culture that valued cuisine more explicitly than the Anglo-American tradition. Whether Canadian military authorities accommodated these cultural differences in ration design during World War II remains an underexplored question in military history. Modern Canadian IMPs do offer some menu variations for religious dietary requirements: kosher, halal, Hindu vegetarian, reflecting Canada's official multiculturalism policy, but whether similar considerations existed in the 1940s is less clear. The physical act of eating in combat conditions created its own challenges beyond ration adequacy. In extreme cold, soldiers wore multiple layers of gloves, making the manipulation of cans, packages, and utensils difficult. Removing gloves to eat risked frostbite. The metal of mess kits and canteen cups would freeze to bare skin on contact. Simple acts like opening a can with a P38 opener or stirring coffee became small battles against the elements. Men learned to keep their P38 can openers on their dog tag chains, where body heat prevented them from freezing. They discovered that certain ration items could be eaten while still wearing gloves, crackers, hard candy, chocolate bars, while others required bare hands. These tiny adaptations accumulated into a body of folk knowledge passed from veteran to replacement, never appearing in official manuals but crucial for survival. Sleep and food compete for limited rest periods in combat. An exhausted soldier might face the choice between heating a ration properly or getting a few extra minutes of desperately needed sleep. Often sleep won, and the ration got eaten cold or not at all, further compounding the caloric deficit. The unwinnable war. The comparison between Canadian and American cold weather rations during World War II ultimately reveals more about human nature than about military logistics. We want our team to be superior, our nation's solutions to be better, our forces to have the edge. This desire for validation leads to myths that outlast the conflicts that spawn them. The truth is less dramatically satisfying but more instructive. Both Canada and the United States entered World War II with inadequate field rations for cold weather operations. Both nations recognized these inadequacies through bitter field experience. Both attempted innovations to address the problems, with varying degrees of success limited by the technology and understanding of the time. Neither nation solved the cold weather feeding challenge during the war itself. The real victory came in the decades after 1945, when military establishments in both nations applied lessons learned through wartime failure to develop genuinely improved ration systems. Modern Canadian IMPs and American MREs, while still far from perfect and still subject to soldier complaints, represent quantum improvements over their World War II ancestors. They provide adequate calories, resist freezing better, heat more easily, offer greater variety, and address nutritional completeness in ways that 1940s rations never could. These improvements came not from one nation outcompeting the other, but from shared recognition of common problems and parallel development of solutions. The soldiers who fought in the frozen Italian mountains, who climbed Riva Ridge at night or advanced through the Po Valley in February, who fought with empty stomachs and frost-numbed fingers, they deserved better than what either nation could give them in 1945. Not because their quartermasters were incompetent or uncaring, but because the technology, science, and institutional knowledge necessary to truly solve cold weather feeding simply didn't exist yet. Understanding this shared inadequacy, acknowledging the parallel struggles rather than claiming false superiority, honors those soldiers more truthfully than any comfortable myth ever could. The next time someone claims Canadian rations were better than American during World War II, or vice versa, the most accurate response is simple. Both were insufficient, both nations knew it, and the soldiers of both countries suffered for it while accomplishing extraordinary things despite their hunger. That's the real story, and it's more than enough.